64 with a cassette tape drive if you want to go head to head. But anyway, but in essence, right now I'm a sociologist by training. So I tend to look at this entire space as sociology of technology and how that evolves. So it's a little bit of a different frame maybe than some of the other tech space discussion around it. To start that off and just to introduce you to the type of frameworks that we use in sociology to take a look at it, I want to ask you a question, just a trivia question. Some of you may know the answer to this, but when was the first US speeding infraction? In other words, like somebody violating a speed limit for driving in the United States. 1907. Close. A little bit late, but close. Maybe this will help. Does that help at all? Take another guess. Oh, very good. Okay, so 1899, actually. And the important thing, oh, and by the way, it was, how fast do you think it was? 20 kilometers? That's exactly right. It was 12 miles an hour in New York City with a car just like this. And the key around this, though, is not so much that there was a speed limit or that somebody got a ticket. It's actually the vehicle itself. So if you take a look at that, do you notice anything kind of funky about it by any chance? Where's the horse? Okay, so it's not a, so it is the Horseless Age, which is the newspaper and the magazine that was around at that time. It was called the Horseless Age. That was the first one before you had Automotive Age. Additionally, where's the gas? That's actually an electric car. So the very first speeding ticket was an electric car. We now have Tesla, and Elon Musk has invented the electric car, apparently. But the first speeding ticket was an electric car. And actually, back then, there were 3 competing technologies for engine propulsion. Do you know what those were? Besides gas and electric? Steam, there you go. So we had steam as well. And actually, all of the engineering literature that you read from back then suggested that steam was by far the most efficient technology, and gasoline was the worst of the 3. And actually, gasoline was undersold by both steam and electric in the early industry in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And what happened was there was a chance event. They had races for these cars. And the steam engine was so efficient, it didn't need a transmission, it didn't putter, it didn't cough, it didn't stall. It was so efficient, producing so much energy, that the car actually itself broke down. The axles broke on the car because it was spinning the wheels so quickly. And that small chance event led to the inefficient technology taking over and dominating that industry. And then you know what happened. We ended up with that. That you might recognize. Trivia in the background there, 1907, 1897. Detroit, spot on. We have an automotive expert back there. Packard Automotive, which is one of the major producers in Detroit. And the key around that is those 3 technologies in the North American auto industry were actually regionally based. So Detroit, which was in the Midwest, was gasoline based. The technology that dominated in that region was gasoline engines. The Northeast was steam, so New England, predominantly around Massachusetts and a little bit of Connecticut. And then New York City and down the eastern seaboard was electric. And what happened is, after that competition, they got out-competed by Detroit. You ended up with Packard and all of the big automotive manufacturers that occurred there. And just to go back to the trivia person in the back there, how many automobile manufacturers were in the United States over the history? 73. Okay, you're losing all credibility now. I'm sorry. You were doing so well. There were actually close to 3,000 automobile manufacturers in the United States. So I was just hearing the side conversations about, oh, there's all these blockchain events going on around town. There's hundreds of them. Kind of the same idea. Lots of things being founded. Lots of failures. And this spawned, this type of industry and this type of research spawned an entire area in organizational sociology called organizational ecology that takes a look at this growth and death of organizations. And what happened to Detroit, though? You ended up with a flight to suburbs. And of course, the oil shocks in the 70s. So 1973, 1979, gas prices went up. Detroit started to suffer drastically. What we would call that in organizational sociology is there was an environmental shift in the business environment, right? So the environment shifted, the organizations were not matched as well to the environment anymore, and all of a sudden you had the Japanese automotive manufacturing, which did not require as much gas, take over the industry to a large extent. And then what ended up happening is selection, Darwin. And this core of organizational ecology is basically applying Darwin's theory of evolution to industry evolution and taking a look at it in that perspective. And that plant, the Packard plant, turned into that. Now, just for the trivia buffs in the audience, try to name this innovation ecosystem. Here's an innovation. The eco-friendly glass. This eco-friendly glass greatly improves building heat retention, reducing energy consumption. Hold that one in your mind. Think of what you think that technology is. This innovative technique using all organic, and I stress organic because organic is very key to this and might be a big clue to you about where it is. This technique using all organic materials allows for easy transplantation of shellfish beds, another hint, to bring sustainable food source to new areas. This innovation targets the rapid spread of disease by reworking the waste stream infrastructure. Some good buzzwords in there. And this revolutionary building material can be formed into unique shapes, which are free of many internal thrusts and strains, common in other established building materials. Ideas? First one is double glazed glass. You know which innovation ecosystem we're in yet? Where? Sorry? Oh no, which city, which region are we, which region is famous for all three, or all four of those innovations? There's a, what? Seattle, okay. Based on the organic shellfishy type thing. Yeah, maybe, Seattle, where else? California, did I hear, from 1897? Okay, so California back in 1897, okay. Where else? Huh? Japan, okay, so we're expanding out globally. We're getting warmer, kind of. London, getting closer. This is double pane glass. This might help you, double glazed glass. This might help out. This is oyster farming. So oyster farming was created here. Is this helping yet? Sewers. Maybe this is giving it away. Concrete. There you go. Okay, one of the most innovative ecosystems that existed was Rome. Now, I know that seems like ancient history, no pun intended, maybe a little. So that's ancient history for you. But in essence, it was an innovation ecosystem, the same way that we think about Detroit being an innovation ecosystem, the same way that we think about modern innovation ecosystems. These come and go, and that's core of how we view it in the organizational ecology framework. It's that they rise, they no longer match the environment, and they die. And then it moves on. Something else gets born, takes over that suits the new environment. So what happened to this? They had wars. They had inequality, the 99% movement of Rome. They had high crime rates. They also had a pushback against paying taxes, and people started to flee. Oh, and there was lots of corruption, too. Sounding familiar, like someplace in the modern world? Anyway, perhaps the Colosseum, which you might be familiar with there. Yeah, which Colosseum's that? The Apple Coliseum of Silicon Valley Roman Empire, the Silicon Valley Empire, right. So this is the Apple headquarters that is popping up down in Silicon Valley. And let's talk about Silicon Valley for a second and think about these types of organizations. Because this is a booming innovation ecosystem. If you would ask people now, like, oh, where's innovation happening? And a lot of people's first knee-jerk reaction would be Silicon Valley is the heartbed of innovation. There's no place else in the world that can ever compete with them. That's it. They are the end. They are the best. We have to do everything just like them if we want to do well. But let me put forth to you this argument. What they have thrived on is platforms which enhance trust and facilitate efficient transactions. The bulk of those organizations that are famous from Silicon Valley basically just are what we would call in organizational sociology, classic central organizational middlemen from a network brokerage perspective. So let me just put that into English for you. They're middlemen. The type that my grandfather would always say, cut out the middleman. Go direct, buy wholesale, right? That type of thing. I grew up in New York, in case you can't tell from the speed of the speech. But in essence, they basically are middlemen. Now, if we step through just a few classic examples, everybody talks, in the pitches about, oh, we're going to be the Uber of X. What is Uber? Uber is a matching platform. That's all it does. It basically just facilitates trust between a rider and a driver. And they take a cut off the middle. That's their sole business model. If you look at a Facebook or a Google, their sole business model is to aggregate demographic information from individuals that people volunteer to give them in exchange for almost nothing, and then sell it as an aggregate pool to advertisers. They're just middlemen. They have replaced and disrupted, if you want to use the buzzwords of the technology era, they've disrupted the existing industries by becoming slightly better middlemen than the ones that used to do it. So Uber has disrupted taxis. Google has disrupted, I would argue, the media industry and the newspaper industry to a large extent by becoming a much more effective targeted advertising platform. But basically all they're doing is aggregating demographic profiles. The same as the newspapers used to do. The newspapers used to say, hey, our readers are between the ages of 35 and 50. They have an average income of X. Buy ads, reach our audience. Google says, we know that this guy is going to be at this cafe at 6:59 p.m., maybe 7 o'clock if he's running late, because we know that his partner actually was running late today based on where her phone location is. So we could target an ad at a slightly different time. So it's much more effective, and they could charge a little bit more because of the precise targeting of the ads. But in essence, they're just aggregating that information, and they're just middlemen. And you can run through almost every Silicon Valley major success story, and they're just centralized platforms that handle that middleman position. Okay, they profit from brokering transactions in a centralized trust structure. They rely on you saying, we trust them with our information, and the customers, basically, of them, trust them to bring them something that's been aggregated by them. They're just centralized brokers. Okay, we have a theory called network opportunity theory. And if you take a look at this, just a really simple type of network, looks kind of like an airline route map, or for those of you that are in the networking space, actually looking at an actual network. But in essence, if you take a look at these connections where the dark lines, there should be a laser on this thing, let's see. Yes, so if you look at these dark lines, let's say that those are the actual connections. And let's say these are the providers of something, and these are potentially the customers, and these are the middlemen. And then they have multiple paths that they can go through to get there. What network opportunity theory would suggest is that these dotted lines where there isn't a connection is an opportunity for a startup or some sort of a service to connect. It's what's called in our language, in sociology, a structural hole. So it's a structural hole in the network. You just think of it as a gap in the network, in essence. And the argument from that theory is basically that things that fill that hole will have a higher birth rate and a lower death rate. Again, going back to the evolutionary model, the same as the sub-Saharan African animals going and drinking water from the right type of hole, and these types of things. Okay, so some language for you. As the structure of competition becomes centralized in network terms, new structural holes discovered in the shifting network maps are strong potential opportunities for new market entrants. But basically all that's saying is that if things are not connected and they're having to go through a middleman, there's an opportunity to enter the market, right? Or enter and serve that connection. There's talks in this literature about multiple types of networks where they've been applied. Some are logistical. These are kind of obvious if you think through them. Airline, rail, bus, kind of obvious if you have to go through a connecting hub, a direct connection. There might be an opportunity if there's enough traffic that goes through the hub. For those of you that are flying to the east coast of Canada, if you didn't have to change planes in Toronto to go to Halifax, there might be a market for that. If there's enough people doing that, there's a market that develops in it, that type of example. Communication is another example. So networks, magazines, all of these types of things that actually connect people. Taking the newspaper example, think about a newspaper for a city that brings information to people. It's a centralized information aggregator. But then if it becomes very centralized, perhaps it becomes too general, you'll see a specialist opportunity for, let's say, an ethnic newspaper to pop up in the city to service a particular ethnic community within that city, or a technical newspaper, or technical news, or a blog, or whatever it may be, to fill that gap and actually give information that's targeted for that specific match. And the other is brokerage. So this is for financial services, and things like a stock market are a centralized clearance. But also investment banks, VCs, and all of this. And there's been studies in most of these industries that have actually found these types of patterns holding across them. Okay, so getting back to platforms. Network opportunity theory would basically construct those Silicon Valley platforms as trusted brokers. And platform organizations basically serve as a source of third-party trust. And it's authenticated because you put your trust in these organizations for whatever reason. But distributed trust totally eliminates the need for that. So now we're getting, you were wondering, like, why are we here? Why are we at blockchain and all this type of stuff? But basically, blockchain, in essence, reduces the need, as many of you know, for centralized trust. We have a term again in sociology for it called a community form of organization, a C form of organization. And basically, C forms have been around for a long time, just like the automobile that was electric powered back in the 1800s. Do you know the earliest one? I have to go back to you again. What was it? Pretty close. It's the Oxford English Dictionary. It was actually the first one of these organizations that was designed in a community form. And this is not one that pops to mind immediately, but the way that they created the Oxford English Dictionary was very similar to the way that you would create ones that you're now familiar with, like Wikipedia, which are a similar form. This was created by saying, please send us all words you know by postcard. It's a little less efficient than going into an online system. It's not GitHub, gotcha. But in essence, it was the same model. Send us a postcard, give us the word, give us a definition, give us a few uses of that word so we understand what it is. These postcards came in over a long, long time. I believe it was something like 15 to 20 years before the first edition was actually aggregated. And then eventually they were able to produce this, and it was updated based on a community of people that came together in this community form of organization. They didn't have great technology, right? In terms of, it was the post. Post wasn't terribly reliable, although it did use the printed word, so maybe that was a technology of a certain kind that was better than what you would have had before by just passing it by word of mouth and hoping people remembered it, you could argue. But more recent examples that might be familiar in terms of C forms are, for those of you that do statistical analysis, is created by a community just like this. It's open source, as you would say, you know, so it's an open source software that's basically created by a community that contributes their code to the base and builds it. Wikipedia is a classic example that a lot of you are familiar with. Firefox, another classic example. Most of the internet, actually, so all of the mail packages, all the web servers, Apache, all this kind of stuff is all created using this type of community form of organization. And then, of course, the big elephant, I wouldn't say in the room, but another animal, of course, is Linux, which is a very large open source community and one of the ones that became most well known as being designed in a community form of organization. Now, the interesting thing, though, these all provide competitive force against existing organizations that are not designed as community forms. So they are what for-profit organizations would categorize as threats. They like to use war terminology and these types of things. So what ended up happening is when Linux came about and started to gain a little bit of traction, you're probably familiar with it, but we ended up having, does this ring any bells? Something called the Halloween papers. Empty. Interesting. Let me tell you. It's fascinating. You have to read these, okay? So go ahead afterwards, Google Halloween papers and take a deep read on them. What these are, these were internal documents that got leaked out of Microsoft of how do we strategically respond to the threat of Linux. Fascinating reading. And it basically highlighted that the strategy that they were going to try to utilize was something called FUD, which you might have heard of, fear, uncertainty, and destruction. Basically say all the things that you might be hearing now about blockchain. It's not reliable, it's not trustworthy, the security's terrible, who's ever going to trust this thing? How are you going to bring it into a real corporate environment to apply because it's just created by these random people who you don't know? How do you know a hacker is not going to put a backdoor into it? All these types of things. That was what they were going to do, and that was their media relations strategy to deal with it. And they said specifically, there's nothing to acquire because there's no organization, there's no classic organization. And in the documents, they said, we can't use our normal strategy. What's our normal strategy? Buy up threats, and then either merge them in or shut them down. But there's nothing to buy. It was this community that was out there, and they couldn't do anything about it. So they said, we're going to go to this FUD tactic. I would personally argue Jamie Dillon from Chase that's been using this around blockchain in terms of creating fear, uncertainty, and destruction around blockchain, quite probably is using quite a similar strategy while they're on the back end trying to figure out how to deal with what's coming. Yes, please. Yeah, so he has been backstepping on it now because he's been getting pushback on it, and he's been saying blockchain is the future, Bitcoin is a scam. Fair enough. What we're seeing, though, is a lot of these centralized actors are creating fear and uncertainty around it, right? And sociology would predict this. The Halloween papers are really a wonderful thing to take a look at if you want to get some insight into how these organizations think. And in essence, that response is something that we're currently facing. Okay, so back to this. the platforms and trust, if you think about this distributed trust that's out there, then you have to wonder, what is the purpose of the Silicon Valley classic platforms once you no longer have a need for third-party trust? What is their business model after that? How are all those wealthy people going to survive in their $1 million mansion? Well, $1 million, sorry, that wouldn't be a mansion. How are they going to survive in their $1 million shared studio apartments in Silicon Valley if there's no longer a need for these centralized organizations? The opportunity here for the growth of distributed trust is really quite large to disrupt what we see as the classic Silicon Valley structure. Okay, so Silicon Valley claims to be cooperative. You hear these buzzwords all the time when you talk to people from down in the valley. We have a collaborative workplace, we just improve the world, we do all these wonderful things, you know, and we work together and all of that. But it's basically just built on an exit model. Almost everything there is designed around building organizations to exit, not to survive. And it's what we would term in organizational sociology the social construction of reality, or the social construction of value. Basically, what the model is you pump up organizations to the point where you could get an exit event. And if you talk to young entrepreneurs in the Valley, and some in Vancouver, their primary thing is, what's your exit event? How are you going to sell it? Who's going to acquire it? How are you going to get out? How are you going to get the money out in 5 years, 10 years, whatever the turnaround is? But it's basically pumping it up and then selling it off. It's a pump and dump scheme to a large extent for a lot of the startups that are there. I went through the bubble in the 90s. I did the startup scene in the 90s, pre the first bubble, and saw the transition of the Valley at that time. And it's turned into, instead of people creating cool things, it turned into people talking about stock options. I could give you the example of a former student of mine. I used to teach at Berkeley down near Silicon Valley. And I had a student that had graduated, this was in the 90s, and bumped into them around 1999 or so. They had graduated as an undergraduate in marketing from the business school. They had taken a job working as a vice president of marketing, as a 21-year-old vice president of marketing for a startup that was venture funded. It was a visible startup. They destroyed, they ran through, they burned up all of their cash, and they failed miserably. And everything was attributed to poor marketing. Basically an overspend on marketing that wasn't well targeted, and they burned through all their cash. So she was responsible for the failure of this organization and burning through the money. And I saw her and I said, okay, so what now? Like, what's next? She's like, well, I got a job offer. It's not a very good job offer. I said, what do you mean? Where did you get a job offer? And she said, I got a job offer at Wells Fargo. It's not a vice president's position. She, at this time, was 23 years old. It was just before the bubble burst. So basically 2000-ish. It's not a vice president, and they don't give me options. Like $80,000 a year was the salary in the US for a 23-year-old. It's like, you should adjust your expectations at this point. You basically have the only thing on your resume is that you've destroyed a venture-funded startup. As the vice president of marketing, you're getting an offer for marketing in a big established company at $80,000 US a year. It might not be such a bad choice. Okay, fine. She didn't take it. I saw her about a year later. I was back in the Bay Area, and I was shopping around Union Square at Nordstrom's. She was working in the sales department at Nordstrom's. The market had burst, and she got readjusted. But the point is that the entire model is built on unreasonable expectations. When you pump up a bubble like that, you get people who start to believe in it, and they're focused on these exit events. Okay, but now we're starting to get pushback on the financialized model quite a bit. There's a corruption narrative that's starting to go on in the States and more broadly in the developed world, where there's a lot of corruption. There's also an earnings wage gap. You had the whole Occupy movement that started up and spread, and there is rising populism that's been coming. We might have seen some of that happening south of the border with not the election yesterday, but about a year ago. There's pressure coming up on this point. There's also in Silicon Valley this whole bro culture thing going on. So all of the gender discrimination stuff is starting to pop out, which is the side effect of having organizations that have cultures, organizational cultures that are designed by people in their 20s. Men in their 20s designing companies to serve men in their 20s or basically replace their parents. Because a lot of the organizations, these platform organizations, are basically providing services to replace mom. Maybe I'm a little too cynical. There's also lots of visible security hacks that are going on. So there's been one after another of these things getting hacked into, and people are starting to lose trust overall through a whole series of these types of things. These supposedly trusted central institutions and these platform organizations, people are starting to doubt and starting to question if they should trust them. Back to organizational sociology, that's an opportunity for distributed trust. That's a classic shift of the environmental structure. If people are no longer trusting that central institution, that is the birth opportunity for distributed trust to enter those structural holes. The technology shifts that you all have been witnessing are part of this advance. And the decentralized and distributed trust models are perhaps what's going to fill that trust gap that now exists. That is a major structural hole that exists now. So what about Vancouver? We have a well-educated, multicultural workforce that basically designs for the world. One of the things that you see in terms of the activity that we do have here with startups, compared to the Valley in particular, is we tend to have a model of people creating organizations that actually think about the global market from the get-go instead of just capturing a local market. Partially because of the size, partially because of the diversity that we have in Vancouver, partially because of the Canadianism of it, whatever it may be. When you take a look at the various rankings of the various ecosystems of the world, Vancouver ranks fairly highly on a global perspective for the startup activity that occurs within Vancouver. There's also a strong history of cooperative culture. And I'm not talking about just blockchain cooperative. I'm talking about the classics that have been here for a while. Van City, MEC, Modo, the first car sharing. These types of things are a history here. The hippie movement from the 60s, Vancouver, Kitsilano. It doesn't look like hippies anymore, but that's a separate story. And in essence, there's early signs of an emerging innovation ecosystem here. And it's also, as you're aware, a distributed trust ecosystem. And Vancouver, perhaps, is leading to a large extent in this space. But I would argue to you that there's a tension going on right now within that ecosystem, very broadly. Parts of the ecosystem are talking about how to become Silicon Valley North, how to replicate Silicon Valley. But all of the lessons from organizational sociology and organizational ecology would suggest you don't want to copy an old model. You're not going to do as well at an old model than the hotbed of that model. It's an issue of figuring out what the current environment looks like and what that future environment is going to look like and designing for that, instead of designing for what is already dying off. Because yeah, Silicon Valley is in a decline. I know that sounds ridiculous to some of you. But if you look at the long-term historical patterns of these ecosystems, they are already past their peak. You're starting to see all the warning signs from a historical perspective. So I would argue that there's a future for the platform C-forms. Traditional Silicon Valley model of commercial centralized platforms will see substitution. In other words, some of them will start to die off. Think about what's the purpose of Uber if you don't need to have a central third-party trusted organization? If you could just trust a rider and a driver directly? Why would you need an organization like Uber to take a cut in the middle? Or take it one step further. Let's think about Google or Facebook. Let's say that you owned your own information, your demographic profile, your browsing profile, your geolocation history, all the stuff that you give them for free. Some of you probably don't in this room, but that many people give them for free. If you own that personally, and let's say that there was just like hypothetically a cafe that wanted to sell an ad to you. Previously, it would be like, oh, you're located right now at Robson Square. There's a cafe that might be open around the corner. Facebook will say, hey, we know they drink caffeine at 9:49 p.m. Would you like to push an ad to them? We'll sell you an ad to that person on their phone. We'll target it right in there and try to get them to come into your cafe. And they'll charge them a fee for that. And then if there's an action that takes place, they'll get paid for it. What if you instead own that profile, as you can do with these distributed technologies? And if you had set up a profile saying, I'm willing to actually let you know my location within a postal code district or whatever it may be, in exchange for 15% off coffee, if it's in the time zones where I know that I want coffee. And if it's outside my normal coffee time, I don't want it. But that value can be transferred directly to you, and you could capture the full value of that information that you're providing for free right now. Because that geolocation and that pattern and all of your history is the valuable product that is being sold by a lot of these platforms. So if you could sell that individually, you could capture a much larger share of that. Distributed trust-based based platforms, collectively owned in cooperative structures, allow individuals and organizations to interact through the platform with minimal transaction costs. It's a term that we would use. It reduces the transaction. The middlemen are not going to be shaving off as much, and you're going to push the value out to the true value creators. So the driver for a ride hailing, not that that's going to last that much longer because they're going to be autonomous cars, but that's a separate story. But in essence, the owner of the autonomous car, instead of the driver, will get the full revenue from that, as opposed to a central matching platform getting the revenue from that per se. Vancouver has the opportunity to design a new style of innovation ecosystem without the burdens of Silicon Valley inertia. So let me put that into real words for you. Back to that organizational ecology. The arguments in organizational ecology are that innovation ecosystems and organizations, when they're founded, the day they're founded, they're already starting to become mismatched with the environment. And then once they've become so largely mismatched with the environment, they eventually fail. And the reason that they cannot catch up is because of something called inertia, which means that they change slower than the environment changes. And I would argue that the ecosystems are the exact same thing. Eventually, ecosystems don't match the current geopolitical environment, and eventually they start to wane and fail, and new ecosystems come and flourish. The same way that Route 128 lost to Silicon Valley to a certain extent, and now is popping back up in a totally new environment of the biotech space. But these kind of wax and wane, the same way Detroit disappeared, the same way Rome disappeared. Platform C-forms produce value and opportunities in different ways than the current ecosystem model of Silicon Valley. It's not a VC-funded model. Apologies to the VCs in the room. But in essence, it's not a central VC-funded model. It's actually value around the periphery. The network itself, the core technology, is not the thing that's owned. That's shared. It's done cooperatively. There could be profit opportunities around the edges, perhaps, or through joint ownership of aspects of it, but the core is not the thing that's actually owned. That's not where the value capture is from a business perspective. So the Googles and the Ubers are dominating the part that is no longer going to be profitable going forward. So ecosystem questions. As Vicky mentioned, I'm heading this research center at Sauder, and these are some of the questions that we're trying to solve. So the big theoretical questions are: what enables innovation to emerge? What makes ecosystems work? What makes ecosystems fail? And then what are the alternatives to the Silicon Valley model? And applications of distributed trust C-forms, which is where we have gotten interested in collaborating with Blockchain at UBC and the broader community. Because in essence, the blockchain, and I'm sorry if this is sacrilegious to say this, not necessarily convinced blockchain is going to be the technology that eventually wins out, but some form of distributed trust will win out. It might not be blockchain, it might be some tree hash or whatever it may be, whatever comes next that solves some of the current barriers. The same way as way back in the 80s, when I was working on something called a campus-wide information system protocol, which you probably have never heard of. Do you know QUISP? You do know QUISP? You've heard of QUISP? Okay, so I worked for the creator of QUISP. Wow. And we launched the first, this is back in the 80s, we launched the first campus-wide information system portal, as it was called. This was before HTML. So some of the younger people in the room are like, there was a time before HTML? Yeah, there was. We created our own protocols. It was on a mainframe, and then we were talking about trying to figure out how to get it out to people. And it was always this incredibly frustrating experience because there was so much potential of this network communication, but the only people who had access to it were people with strong technical skills. Very similar to the types of things you see going on right now with people having access to the blockchain community. There's a technical barrier for the mainstream adaptation. It's starting to move, but it's still a bit of a barrier for a lot of people. My question for you would be what role, and this is another question of the center, platform co-ops are going to play in this. So changing the ownership structure of how things operate. Perhaps some sort of a platform model might be the thing that does it. And it has some local implications for you as well. First of all, what should Vancouver do? Because there is this tension that I alluded to of should we be Silicon Valley North? Should we try to pull in VC? Should we try to pull in investment? Should we try to basically replicate the Silicon Valley model? Personally, I would argue we will never do that as well as Silicon Valley does it. That's a losing battle. That's fighting, if you want to use those types of analogies, that's fighting on the wrong battlefield. The role of Vancouver's strong history of cooperative culture is key to this picture, though. And I would push to you what changes are actually needed to figure out that new ecosystem model. Because we have the opportunity to create that here. Because BC at UBC community can help that evolution, and what role can you play individually in it? And collectively. Because that system is outdated, and it will fail. Just like every other innovation ecosystem that has before. And the true question is, how do we design for that future instead of designing for the past? And you all are part of that. And with that, thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Marc-David. That is a lot to think about, and you've taken us very gracefully through some pretty heavy-duty sociological theory that is underpinning all of these ideas. And I think, one of the things I will just say about understanding theory and the research that grounds the theory is that you can make predictions, just as you were doing, and you can position. It gives us an advantage because when we can see, based on theoretical predictions, where things might end up, we know strategically where to position our businesses and our activities. So theory is kind of a powerful thing. So there's hopefully lots of questions forming in your mind. Just to seed the discussion, one of the things that I'm hearing from ventures that are coming to talk to us, companies, that is, well, what should we do about the IP? We really want to, we have to lock down the IP discussion, before we collaborate. And so I wanted to ask you, with respect to IP, it sounds like, and I don't know if this is right or not, but it sounds like kind of the old-fashioned model is, hold on to the IP, build it, keep it to yourself, but that there might be this new model that could be more productive where you're actually trying to build open source and then build on it. So maybe we could start with having you comment on that.
Sure. So
a lot of people are formulating questions.
Sure. So yeah, I agree fully that the old IP protection is definitely part of the old model in terms of trying to control. The parallel that I would draw, and this was drawn in the discussion actually of the Halloween papers as well, is centrally planned economies versus free market. And ironically, all the for-profit organizations that try to capture the IP, that's a centrally planned economy. Right? Because they're basically saying, we've created this thing and then we have a 5-year plan. They talk about 5-year and 10-year strategic plans the same way as a centrally planned economy talks about it. And the free market of ideas is realistically how this is going to be evolving. And it's much more powerful over time. In terms of locking down IP, from the sociological perspective, it would be figuring out joint forms of ownership over the relevant bits to protect them. Perhaps open source contracting, the similar types of language that create around the Creative Commons and all this type of stuff might be one angle. But the value creation model is different now. Because the old value was capturing that IP and then basically running it to death and capturing all the value from it. The value now will be on the services that come up and pop up around it. So it's not going to be owning the blockchain per se. It's going to be perhaps helping people adapt to it, or wallet technologies, or the apps that come on top of it. And these types of things are probably where some people will make some of their revenue. But it's also going to be the people providing the services through these. And a lot of it is going to move to the value creation as opposed to just capturing, owning, and then extracting.
Interesting. Questions? If you've got questions, I've got the mic and I'll pass it along. One of the other questions I had, and I don't want to let you get away without speaking about this. So, governance. Central organizational models have this, strong hierarchical governance. We see, public blockchains like Bitcoin. There's all this talk about, will we go this way or that way? SegWit 2 fork, seemingly out the door. So. What about governance in these new C-form type organizations? Isn't that something we still need, or how do we look at this?
Yeah, so the governance problem actually is solved in different ways. So it's not through classic hierarchy. It's frequently perceived as rings of hierarchy. So you have the central core. So in a lot of the open source groups and communities, you have a central core of developers that are kind of the hardcore folks around it. And then there's people on the periphery. And the big key, though, is that the periphery is a lot more flexible. So people can kind of come and go and contribute as they want, participate when they want, very much in terms of that. But in terms of the decision making, there's probably going to be these various distributed forms of decision making as well for a lot of the governance questions. You know, the DAO is maybe not the best example because of the way it was hacked. But in essence, the underlying philosophy around the idea of distributed governance, I think, is sound. And I think there's some technological barriers that will be overcome without, I have no doubt in the techies figuring out the security issues on it. It's more the underlying organizational structure, and it will be distributed governance, is my guess.
Interesting. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, in the C form organizations, what are the dynamics in a healthy kind of organization? What are the dynamics between people that would enable more innovation? You know, because normally in the, you know, if you want maximum control, you provide a single person emanating information out to people, and everyone is just passive listeners. But then in a more distributed network, you get more interaction. I'm just wondering what would be a good model for how to work cooperatively to, as you said, overcome Silicon Valley inertia. What are the dynamics between people that would need to be there?
So two parts to the answer, if it's okay. One is it depends what the C form is trying to accomplish, and different C forms will have optimal structures that vary depending on what the actual goal is. The same as classic organizations have different structures that serve different purposes. But generally, the broader question that you've asked is like, how do you get people working together collaboratively? And one of the aspects that actually plays into a lot of the C forms, we studied the open source C forms already, and some of the factors that actually help there are strong culture. So cultural symbolism that occurs with it. So you see a lot of the classic things that you would see at strong culture, classic organizations, transforming to the C forms as well. So common language, common culture, common acronyms, common jokes, these types of things. But the other aspect that was also critical is a sanctioning mechanism. And that's always a little bit touchy to deal with. But basically, if there's bad behavior, there has to be a mechanism to actually monitor that as well at a communal level. So if you look at the classic of, you might be familiar with the old DMOS. DMOS, is that, no? Yes, no, maybe? Okay, so back before Google, yes, no, maybe? Back before Google, no, okay. Have you heard of a company called Yahoo? Yeah? Okay, good. Okay, so we'll start there. Do you remember, okay, you might not remember though, but Yahoo, how it structured the information that it cataloged from the internet? It was kind of humans that actually categorized it into categories. It was like kind of looking through a telephone book almost, or maybe not, yeah, more like a yellow pages almost. You know, you'd flip and say, oh, I need an automotive dealer, and you would go to the auto section, and then there would be all these human categorized things. DMOS was actually an open source community that produced most of that data for Yahoo, Google, and hundreds of other sites on the internet. I did participant observation with DMOS for a period of about 7 years, working through their system and becoming an editor at this thing, where you basically said, we're adding a site, and then all of a sudden it distributed out to all of those. And one of the mechanisms that worked within the DMOS community was actually tracking down people that had bad intention, because there was a large economic incentive for people to get their site into that, because the second it was accepted, it had basically good penetration on Google, Yahoo, and all these other websites. And in essence, having that sanctioning mechanism and a protective mechanism was critical to maintain the health and the legitimacy of that central form. I would argue that if you're looking at any of these kind of blockchain communities that are developing now around the various currencies and all of that, you do need to have protection mechanisms as well to make sure if there's bad behavior, it gets shut off quickly and users get reputations. Realistically, one of the other aspects of distributed decision-making is reputation management. And that is a critical component for those forms as well. And if you figure out a good reputation management system, have a nice strong culture around it, and then a shared mission. One of the other things that worked with C forms, by the way, was a common enemy. Blockchain has that, that's no problem. But in essence, like a common enemy to fight against. So the Linux community fighting against Microsoft. I go back to this example of the Halloween papers. When those came out, they had a little blurb in there that said, if we do this one aspect to fight this mechanism is basically creating a very difficult protocol that would be almost impossible to reverse engineer. And they put a time in there, I forget the exact amount, but it was something like it would take them at least 5 years to reverse engineer that. It was issued as a challenge to the entire Linux development community, and they had reverse engineered it about 3 days after the papers came out, and they had improved upon the protocol by the 4th day. And that type of common enemy can actually motivate and pull together and create a strong culture. This is a classic lesson from organizational behavior as well, which is a common enemy can group people together. You might have also seen, you know, kind of military training where they have the nasty drill sergeant and then the team falls together. Sometimes that common enemy can serve the same purpose for the community forum as well. You know, we hate Microsoft, we hate the big banks, whatever it may be, it can help. So.
You mentioned you were in the thick of the .com bubble, and a lot of people would argue we're seeing that right now with blockchain and all the coin offerings. So what do you think the outcome of that will be, and how does that affect the underlying technology?
I could say with 100% certainty that there's going to be a lot of turnover and a lot of deaths of a lot of the various coin offerings that you've seen. No doubt. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. The thing that I do think will happen long term, though, is that there will be births of new ones as well that become better suited and do survive. Which ones shake out? Not very clear. If we took a look at the 3,000 automobile manufacturers as they were all around the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was hard to say General Motors would be one of the ones that actually was going to win that. A lot of people would have said a company called Stanley was going to be the one that won. And again, blankness on that for the DMAS blankness. Stanley Steamer, they were a really good steam engineered car that actually outsold almost everything else. And people would have taken a bet on that. So right now, I don't know which one is going to be. Good chance it won't be Bitcoin. Sorry. Realistically, there's going to be a new technology. There's going to be some technology that solves some sort of a problem with the existing technologies. Don't know what it is, but you've had the discussions around the technical barriers, the speed of transaction, all these types of things. There are clear technical barriers that have to be worked on around security, speed, scalability, all these types of things. And there's a really good chance whatever new chain, or even if it's not a blockchain, whatever new technology figures it out, some sort of zero trust type of model perhaps, where it, you know, and Ethereum I guess is moving to zero trust now too, but yeah. Zero trust, yeah. So the zero trust proof stuff is coming about right now, and there might be something that pops up that figures out how to do that effectively, so you no longer need the trust confirmation even, or possibly, you know, the move from proof of work to proof of stake, all these types of moves. You don't know where that's going to go, but there will be lots of new ones that come about that solve these various problems, and one of those will probably be the one that hits and grows even larger. In terms of the transition from the old, I would imagine that a lot of the for-profit organizations that have power right now in those central locations are going to be fighting tooth and nail to maintain market dominance. So they will be engaging in all sorts of strategies to discredit whatever comes, and also trying to launch their own. But there's a good chance that if they're coming at it with the model of a centralized for-profit, they eventually will be outcompeted, because that will not match what's acceptable later, because it will be a battle of cost and speed and all these types of things.
So you talked a lot about C forms, different, I guess, community forms of organization. Do you think there are some applications that are more like easily adapted to that kind of organization versus other, like, for instance, Bitcoin, you know, is money, and for whatever reason it ended up working out well, but and then Wikipedia, certain kind of information, but do you see some applications being easier to adopt into a C-form organizational structure as opposed to others? Yeah, so broadly, I guess, you know, and this is predicting the future beyond what we know in science right now, to be perfectly blunt, but broadly, I would suggest that the primary problem that a lot of these solve right now is the centralized trust problem. That's how I see a lot of the stuff that's actually been successful. And I think the adoption of it is going to be in locations where the centralized institutions are not very trusted.
So things that actually solve problems in countries, regions, industries that have trust issues right now, this can be a very nice solution to start to solve problems and basically fill structural holes where there's a lack of trust for whatever type of transactions occurring. So economies where they don't trust the central bank, there'll be lots of solutions to pop up there. I would say we want to be scanning a lot of the markets of the world where there isn't a lot of centralized trust in the institutions, figure out the problems there, solve those problems, and that will be what probably grows through this model. That's my guess.
I think turning back to the kind of blockchain technologies, we see that a lot of governments around the world, they're trying to control this because there's definitely a threat from the C communities and blockchain technologies for the government, because then there's no thing to control, there is no object. It's like instead of there's a corporation. How do you see this dynamics playing out for the C forms and governments?
Yeah, so there's one theory in particular from sociology called institutional theory. And there's some interesting stuff going on in that talks about the institutions that run the world over history. And if you look very early, historically, religion was one of the ones that actually organized quite a bit. Religion then got outdated by the nation state to a large extent. The nation state became very important. A lot of the arguments in that at this point would say that the nation state is already no longer running the world. And in reality, the corporate form has overtaken it, because it operates outside of the bounds of the nation state, and corporations in reality have captured the nation states in most economies, and the corporations are truly what's the power source in the world right now, as opposed to the governments. And the governments do what the corporations are wanting in many cases, or the business interests. I would argue that this distributed form is going to be that next power structure that perhaps starts to outdate the existing structures. What ends up happening, though, is that as those new institutions rise and fall, you always see leftovers from the old. So you'll still see certain powerful institutional components of the nation state going forward, and they'll be fighting to maintain their power. Just as the corporations will be fighting to maintain their power, just as certain religions are fighting to maintain their power against the nation state, et cetera. And it's historically, that's where it goes. So I would say it's eventually going to come there. That's what it looks like. But there's going to be fighting all along the way and holding on and capturing power and trying to hold on to it and making it illegal and making it difficult and all of these types of things. That's definitely coming ahead. There'll be lots of FUD. There'll be lots of regulation. There'll be all those things. Corporations will also go after it. They'll try to capture it, buy it, shut it down, whatever it may be. But one of the powers of a community forum is that there isn't a centralized entity to truly shut down. When you shut down one, it pops up somewhere else. And it's very difficult to stop long term.
Thank you.
Sure.
Would you like to comment on the hardware blockchain?
A hardware blockchain, like the need for hardware for miners, you mean, or something more specific?
Something like Intel SGX.
I'm not a techie, so I don't know the debate around that. I apologize. So what's the concern around it, though?
Because you mentioned about scalability, and currently scalability is a big issue.
Oh, so it's a technical solution of basically higher processing power, in essence? I don't know the term SGX. I apologize. So
Intel is coming up with a hardware that will process blockchain at 500,000 transactions per second.
Okay, so in essence, on the technological side, I think that there will be evolution in terms of organizations that come up with stuff, but long term, there's a very good chance that even the technical solutions to solve the various technical barriers are probably going to come out of community forums designing what's actually needed long term as well. And something like Intel, short term, will definitely be, they'll be playing in that space. There's going to be battles between the various semiconductor manufacturers, no doubt. The little bit of naive technical reading that I've been doing is suggesting that the processing power is already no longer becoming as critical as you start to move to some of the other types of hashing techniques. So the, what's it called, the tree hash or something like that, the hash tree, or what's it called? Merkle tree. So as you're moving to that, it reduces the processing power, and the miners are no longer going to need to be that big and that powerful. And that type of technological solution, at least as a non-techie, seems plausible as moving around because the energy consumption for a single Bitcoin transaction is still really large. And if you move to something that actually is more distributed and less power intensive, and if you start getting into the math of the cryptography that actually solves these problems a little bit more efficiently, and perhaps not with multiple miners solving one problem. I believe they actually allocate through this to the individuals based on the ownership of the thing. These types of things I think are probably going to be solving the hardware issue and the scalability issue, but I would totally defer to techies on this. I'm not a techie anymore, so.
Can I ask you about your view on why Bitcoin has been going up in value recently, more than Ethereum and every other things?
Yeah, so I'm fairly agnostic about predicting markets. That I know I should never do because I will most likely make a mistake. It certainly looks like there's a wave right now of people becoming aware of it and a certain amount of bubbly activity, but I wouldn't call it a bubble necessarily. It probably has room to grow. There's going to be a limited supply for a while, so there's probably some growth left in it. In terms of timing on it, would never guess. I would absolutely never guess. It's been a phenomenal growth in the recent, the past 6-7 months. It's unprecedented. And when you look at the graphs, it's cryptocurrency broadly is up to what, like 180 billion now or something such as that, which is amazing. It might go up, it might go down. I would never predict. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Continuing on the governance part, if we talk about Bitcoin, for example, which is the offshoot of blockchain, it started as a way of doing transaction, but somehow community has converted it into, people have not doing transaction, they are hoarding it. So people are kind of speculating it. How do you see these community forms maintaining their focus when they mature?
So this is one of the things, the transition from being transaction-based to basically being a gold standard, for lack of a better way to express it, is perhaps one of the threats for Bitcoin, because if you're not getting the transaction volume with it, it no longer will be a transactive currency. It's not going to be replacing central currency, so there are going to be more transactive systems most likely that come to replace that. In terms of the actual holding on and speculation right now, it's really uncertain where that's going to go, because the question from the nation state is critical, because the governments that are starting to try to control, some are legalizing, some are controlling it. It's currently a mechanism for people to move assets, even personal assets, without necessarily transacting with anybody, but just to move them across border and avoid the nation state. So there will be value in that going forward for quite a reasonable amount of time, as long as it's holding its value. The question I have, and this would be more for the people who understand the technology, is when they're all mined out, what happens at that point? Like once we run out of coin and that production is approaching, and then I don't know what happens to the dynamics of the market then. It's a very good question though.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about if you see it, like the way I see blockchain or Bitcoin is in an architecture term, and I see selfish companies and selfish governments and academics who have grants from universities to spend the money on entering into the Bitcoin space and developing it for their own reasons. Is that C form, or is that headed towards there?
Yeah.
Is there a difference between the architecture model that's I see is working for Bitcoin versus the C-form idea that you're proposing?
Yeah, so fair point, very fair point. So one of the components of the old open source communities was that people were actually not making their living off of the core, right? They were basically doing something else and then contributing and volunteering their efforts. The volunteer aspect of Bitcoin is not there, right? Some of the maintenance stuff it is, but in reality, like the core of it is not as much a classic C-form that way. But that said, there's this one, I just read about it recently, Spiral Networks, which some of you may be familiar with from New Zealand. So they've been structuring basically a series of organizations that basically are part of a cooperative where there is a profit motive for the individuals that actually interact with it. So there still is that profit motive, but they contribute to the central maintenance of this this overall cooperative structure, and then they decide what new projects to engage in. And I could imagine that that type of form will be able to actually grow pretty effectively to create cryptocurrencies or various other types of distributed trust systems, where there still will be some value to be gained by interacting with it for the individuals that interact. So there'll be some market components to that, but there will also be a benefit to them all of collaborating for the center and keeping it. So, you know, if I were to ask you, like, who owns the internet? So, sorry? But which ISP owns the internet? Like if you right now were to send me an email, which ISP does it go over? You have no idea, right? I mean, and it changes second to second depending on where the traffic is. And it's kind of this joint collaborative space. There's for-profit entities all around it. And they have contractual relationships to basically maintain this core. And that can be maintained. So, you know, a blockchain or a distributed trust ledger or whatever it may be can be maintained, and there can be profit motives around the edge, but the core won't have clear ownership anymore, I would argue. But there can still be profit motive. Yeah.
Are there different communities that you see forming then?
It's possible. So I mean, you know, one of the things that's happening is you're seeing hundreds of these different ICOs pop up, and then there's going to be translation features in terms of transactions between the various and shifting value between them. And there's for-profit opportunities for people to basically arbitrage between the values in all these different systems, or to facilitate, create services around it, make it easier for people to get their money in and out, or transact, or buy things, or service networks to help companies install, you know, cash registers that can accept it, or ATMs, or whatever it may be. There's all of these types of value structure around it. The other example I would give you, though, is, you know, think again to Microsoft Linux, right? The Microsoft Linux thing. Microsoft made its money by selling operating system and selling word processing and, you know, spreadsheet types of software on a basis where they would sell you the package and then you would use it. But once you got the purchase, they didn't care if it worked. As a matter of fact, they would just push the product out there and then let you beta test it for them and then complain so they could refine it. The Linux model wasn't making money from selling the software, but it made money from the services of integration to make sure it actually worked for you. And so that value shifted from being the product itself of the software versus the service of installing it. And there's dynamics that are parallel to the blockchain itself is not going to be the source of the revenue, but it's going to be the services around it and the convenience and the apps and whatever comes about around it that most likely will be where the value is actually created for individuals. But there'll still be a market. People need to earn some sort of a living for it to survive.
So we have had a lot to think about. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Marc-David. Applause again for you.